So this is our panel section. If I could just start off by introducing two additional panelists. So one is Emily Harris, who's a principal consultant at SRK Consulting, and also we have Sir Richard Sheriff, who is the founder of Strategia Worldwide. Now, as we go through this, we very much want to be taking questions also from the audience. I think questions can be added through the MINEX app. Please do. We'll be checking out and look forward to inviting. If we could just start off, though, I wonder, Emily, could we start with you? And we have a question on, are ESG metrics providing a representative picture of projects on-the-ground performance?
Thank you for the question, Adam. I think metrics are important. We've heard a lot about them this morning. Disclosure is very important, particularly to the investor market. Thank you. So as we said, metrics are important and important for disclosure. But I think there are certain limitations when you're looking at assets at a site level, because I think sometimes metrics can be disconnected from on-the-ground performance, and it is important to get boots on the ground if you're very interested in a particular asset and the risks around that asset. And that's because the context of every asset is going to be different. Its environmental setting, its social setting, its local geography, its proximity to water, to people, to protected areas. And I think really getting an understanding of that is critical to understanding the key issues of a site. And sometimes when we look at the public information, the metrics maybe don't get to the nub of those key issues, those material issues. And it's important because those key issues can be very complex and very difficult to explain in terms of metrics. So actually getting people on the ground and having a look at assets on a specific basis is very important to do alongside the metric reporting.
Thanks, Emily. Helene, can we sort of continue on that theme and perhaps talk a little bit about why this asset level data is so important?
Thank you. And nice to hear what Emily had to say about that as well. So when we were doing our initial feasibility study on preparing to do an index, a comparative index on the performance of large-scale mining companies, what came up over and over as a gap that people said is that they don't have this aggregated information. And so if a company reports, and some companies have been reporting, for example, our water quality for Latin America averages at whatever, that's not very useful information to engage with a company. It's often, we find, even so one can think about people who are affected, but also other industries. Often other industries, neighbor industries to a mine site, are also affected by various activities. So let's stick to the water example. Similarly, we've even found that some governments that are less powerful than the mining companies that they host also don't get given access to that sort of information, even though it may be a legal requirement. So recent piloting that we did with groups in a Central Asian country, in fact in Kyrgyzstan, who were using a mine site assessment tool to ask some very basic questions around things like water, air, local employment, local procurement, and so on. It came up quite often that people were saying that they hadn't realized they had the right to that information, and even local government were saying that we don't get given that information either. So it's kind of at a very philosophical level, it's the dignity of those around the mine site, whether that's governments, other industries, other farmers, or the local community. The other thing is for investors, great danger lurks around mine sites, because most of the ESG problems are not likely to be, unless it's fraud and corruption at headquarters, it's likely to be something related to the mine site. So having insight to those matters around the asset is really important. And of course, tailings is the prime example. So until very recently, companies were reporting on their tailings facilities, at an aggregate level. And of course, we've seen what happened at Brumagino, the prime example, in January this past year.
Thanks, Helene. So interesting. Terry, I wonder if we could sort of move on from there to there's a question of what should be done to promote greater alignment between ESG codes and the metrics that ESG rating agencies are using.
Thanks. So I think that we are in the relatively early days around ESG ratings and around how that information is used by investors. We are, as we've heard, seeing a huge increase in assets under management that our investors are putting towards ESG and recognizing ESG. But I think there is still lack of alignment on exactly what that means. And there is information that is being provided that is very well intentioned, but sometimes confusing. And look, I think it's a little bit like I've heard people talk about the development of the credit markets and credit ratings. We've seen great convergence over the last 30 years, so that now there are a few well-recognized names that are generally pretty consistent, and I think that will happen in time. But investors have to play a role in that, and investors have to be engaged in the conversation and active. And I hope that organising frameworks like the ones that the World Gold Council have put forward and others can be a really material way of moving that forward. The industries are generally pretty good at knowing what their material risks are, using those to align disclosure that we've talked about a lot, and then ratings on that, and then investors having those conversations with operating companies and anybody else that is involved in that sphere will, I think, help drive better quality of information around ESG.
Yeah. I think focusing on the conversation between miners and investors is exactly it. And with that in mind, Sir Richard, you asked, do miners tell their story well?
No, I don't think they do. I think they tell it terribly. If I compare mining to, for example, oil and gas, oil and gas is on the wrong side of history. Miners are not, as Helen explained very clearly. Mining is essential to the future of our civilization. It's essential to confronting the challenges of reducing carbon emissions, as we heard yesterday. We've got to start now, according to the UN, reducing carbon emissions by 7% annually. And that's not going to happen without the efforts and the benefits produced by mining. So I think the story is told terribly. There's a really noble vision here that needs to be got out there. People need to be educated that mining is fundamental. But at the same time as that, miners need to behave properly. And for all that we've heard, we've heard some really good stuff this morning about the imperative of responsible mining. Not only is it good in its own right, it's good morally, but it's good economically and financially. But yet, miners continue to behave really badly. The tailings dam disaster in Brazil in January this year, again and again. I can think of any number of examples where risk is not looked at comprehensively, that miners come in and start saying, well, we're going to drill through the glaciers in order to release the gold in this biggest of all gold deposits in Latin America, forgetting the impact that's going to have on indigenous communities who depend on the summer snowmelt for their agriculture. Miners operate in Central Asia and are subjected to blockades, and as a result of failing to think comprehensively, failing to link risk and strategy, and failing to plan properly. So miners need to get their act together, but at the same time, part of that act together is absolutely telling a more compelling story, because it's not being done at the moment.
Thank you. Eric, with that in mind, with that sort of background as to sort of explaining the narrative of what miners are doing, we're at in the energy industry. We're obviously at a very important phase of transition, and the mining industry has a huge amount to play in making that transition happen. But investment into exploration for new raw materials has been quite limited. What should be done to support greater investment, and how do you tell a better story in doing so?
Yes, so we all know that exploration has really taken a hit after the super cycle fizzled out, and it hasn't really come back. It has come back a little bit in gold to some degree, but the whole junior mining sector has still very little capital available to how it used to be. And that's a concern, because when I think our friend here from who McCain was talking about the supply we need in the next 5 years to come online, well, we know it takes about 15 years in most cases from exploration to mine, and the success rate from exploration to mine is rather depressing. So you need a lot of exploration. All the copper, for instance, that had been produced since Cyprus started to produce copper 1,500 years ago, needs to produce again the same amount in the next 75 years. So even something as mundane as copper has a tremendous pressure on it to deliver the volumes that drive forward the electrification agenda, let alone the many other special elements from Mendeleev's table. So we have to look at exploration, and we are increasingly of the view that it probably won't happen in the private sector on its own. There probably needs to be a bit more government in some places to kickstart back exploration. Look at the test development in Eastern Europe or in Central Asia, for that matter, in the rich, mineral-rich belt. Exploration is minuscule, it's almost gone. So we will try to put together a small pilot, a facility where we could hopefully towards the end of next year complete it and start investing in some of these exploration companies that would be willing to come to feed it. Because not only a matter of having exploration, it's a big plus to have the right exploration companies, the ones with the skills and the experience before those skills and experience are dispersed into other industries. So there's simply a need to hold on to and develop and nurture this level of exploration. I want to say one thing about oil and gas and mining. We share one thing in common. Society needs us, but they don't want us. And this is where the story about selling mining needs to start. Everybody wants mining if it's not in my backyard. And this is something we need to change. And I think actually we need some more thinking about it, because although we can quickly agree in this room that half an hour of discussion we are all convinced, trust me, I'm sure you know as well, when we travel internationally and meet societies and communities, they are less than convinced about mining. So this really has to change. And I'm happy that EU has a special program to educate schools already at school sort of level about the role of mining now and for the future. And I think we need to reinvigorate that in our countries.
Thank you. Small accent. Thank you, Eric. Iona, would you like to add anything sort of further on that theme? And in particular, what should mining companies be doing right now to make themselves more attractive to investors?
We haven't touched on one aspect of ESG-related disclosure, is the concern that is out there that companies will just do the so-called greenwashing, right? So they will just start ticking the boxes and just, disclosing the right things, and without actually focusing on what is important. And I think we all need to be aware of this, and we all need to be committed to driving change, real change, at the mine level, at the asset level, and then all the way through to the governance aspect of things. And I think what is important that also touches on the, developing the unified guidelines for ESG is that they are in such a structure and shape and form that actually enables real change rather than just top-level disclosure. And this is where investors will, this will enable investors to make real decisions. And also it is for the benefit of the companies, because and I'm talking about publicly listed companies, as a publicly listed company, you usually have certain type of investors in your shareholder base. So this will be mining-focused investors. This will be, for example, if it's an emerging company, emerging markets-focused investor. They don't necessarily invest in mining; they just invest in a company operating in a certain region. And then you have other types of investors, such as hedge funds, such as some retail investors, and so on and so forth. They're just supporting the business for their own purposes. But what ESG enables it to do is actually, in ESG disclosure, is actually tap into the additional pool of investment. So basically, it is to the benefit of a company to start thinking about expanding its shareholder base, which enables better valuation, better liquidity, and all these things that come with the broader investor base. But that needs to be done with real thought in mind that it's not a box ticking exercise. It is something. It is about real change.
Thank you. Could we now add a couple of questions from the audience? And could we start with Mr. Richard Elmer of Knight Peacehold? Richard, please.
I've got to say in person now, have I? I got away with it by just doing it on the app. At Knight Peacehold, we've been involved with the design, construction, supervision, monitoring of over 600 stands around the world over the last 15 or so years. We have a database of those 600 facilities that we have had some involved in. I'm concerned that I hear over part today and over the past few days people talking about key metrics in terms of ESG in relation to tailing stamps and things, but nobody's talked to us. It seems to be at the moment it's being driven by certain industry groups and various other stakeholders, whereas we're the guys that are designing and monitoring these facilities, and I just think there should be better interaction with the consultants, not just us. There are other names that everybody knows around the room. I think a group of the engineers, the designers, not necessarily mining companies, we're the ones that should be getting together and working out how we should be doing this from a technical engineering-driven perspective, not necessarily from a non-governmental or a stakeholder end. It just needs to be driven by the engineering.
Thank you, Richard.
That's more of a statement than a question now. Sorry.
Oh, please, go ahead.
Well, I think it's quite important actually to just clarify that we and others have been working continuously to involve experts and not only multilateral organizations and so on. That experts on the ground are essential to all the discussions that are going on around tailings right now. And I'm happy to talk to you later so that to put you in touch with the people that are organizing all of this.
Thank you. Emily, anything to add from
Yeah,
your
I think you're right. I mean, ultimately what you're looking for is a level of independence. And I think, with there's a company perspective that needs to be brought to the table for sure, and that's where the change will actually be affected. But I think in terms of identifying where issues lie and what issues really are and what are material at a particular operation, I think you do need a level of independence to be able to come in and challenge the messages that are coming out from a particular company or operation at an asset level. And the importance is the asset level, really, because I think it's all very well having a company that has excellent attitudes towards ESG and it has all the right glossy material associated with it, and it's, as you say, ticking the boxes, but really you have to understand the risks on the ground, and particularly with high risk facilities like tailings.
Thank you.
Just a point to add, the Global Tailings Review that I hope you're aware of is now in its consultation phase, and there is being outreach to all stakeholders to be part of that, and Bruno Oberle, the former Swiss minister who's leading that, has put out a video, and it's very clear everybody is invited to be part of that consultation process.
Thank you. So Richard, I wonder, could you add some thoughts on this also? And I think all these questions about tailings are really kind of going at the question of whether the mining industry's attitude to risk, and if you could also talk about the mining industry's general attitude to risk.
Well, continuing the theme, I think what one sees again and again is mining companies saying, yeah, we've got it all taped. No, we're sorted. And then you get Brumadinho, or then you get a disaster, or then you get a massacre of miners in eastern Burkina Faso, as we saw dreadfully about 3 weeks ago. And I think this all highlights a degree of complacency, but it also highlights a tendency to look at risk in silos, to look at engineering risk without thinking about the linkage with social risk or political risk or strategic communications risk and security risk and environmental risk and the lot. So it's all about putting a wrap around risk and understanding the relationship between the measures taken to address one risk and the second and third order effects which might impact elsewhere. It's about linking risk and strategy. And then picking up the theme earlier, if there is to be real change, and I think the general message here is that there's got to be real change in order to demonstrate responsible mining and to demonstrate that mining is fundamental to the future of civilization. At the end of the day, like in any walk of life, you can't mark your own homework. Of course, you've got to do the work. But I mean, hence the importance of that third-party assurance that Terry was talking about. And clearly, it's got to be done together in conjunction with a company. It can't be done any other way. But both for mining companies and mining to be able to demonstrate unequivocally that change is happening in the right direction, and for investors seeking to invest in mining companies, you can't beat third-party independent assurance.
And I would just add one more thing, if you don't mind. Can I just add one more thing? You know, there's a lot of good things happening. There's a lot of companies doing a lot of good work, and that independent verification process can help support that even further. So it's not necessarily just, you know, finding out where the problems lie. I think there's a huge amount of good efforts being done on good ESG work, and I think, you know, having an independent support to that can further strengthen that good performance.
Go ahead.
Okay. Maybe I can get this.
Adam, I'm afraid this is the last time.
This has to be our.
So just for me to say, I absolutely agree, but there is still one problem. We do have mine companies out there, not to be known in our region, but they are fundamentally environmental and sort of, I won't say criminal. They operate facilities that are high risk in some cases. They employ children in the mines. They are operating with tailing dams that are at the risk in geological unstable areas. How do you deal with them? Now, you send someone to look at them and say, oh, this is not good enough. But the real effective stop for this type of activity is actually certification system, so that we can come to the point of something like the SEER system that is underway to make sure that the markets are aware of that hopefully not so many, but really high-risk mining sites in order to shut down traders and bring their metals to market. I know it's not very popular with many of the metal trading platforms and so on, but this has to get done at one point. Because if we don't, it will be those who are setting the future of mining in terms of image, rather than the 95% of companies that are moving to do a good job. So it has to be a third-party verification and a consequence of not meeting minimum standards. It can't be just that you don't get a piece of paper. It has to go beyond that. And this is why I'm happy that EU supporting this SEER certification with the vision that one day the traders that bring really troublesome mines output to market can be shut down. I think that's necessary as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric.